Let me just start by introducing you, if you don't know the Pew Charitable Trusts, that we are an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that's dedicated to the public interest. And Pew has a range of interests that go all the way from global ocean conservation to health policy, but we have scores, we have more than a score, I don't even know how many researchers who are just dedicated to state uh, state fiscal health and the relationship between state and federal, also state and local. One thing to note is that there's also something called the Pew Research Center. You see a lot of stuff from them. It's all mostly polling related. We're kind of we're sister organizations. We have the same board of directors, but in your attribution, we are the Pew Charitable Trusts. Um, I can't really see everyone, but I was going to ask, like, for those I can see, I was curious how many of you actually spend a good deal, like maybe at least half of your time reporting on tax and spending and budget issues. Can I see any hands up? Okay,
I'm
well,
seeing a handful of hands up,
okay,
not a majority, but a handful.
okay. Because like I'm recalling that how intense it was to cover the race to balance budgets in state capitals. And I think you heard this morning from someone at NASBO. Is that correct?
Yes.
Who actually spoke?
Shelby Kearns, their executive
Great.
director, as
Okay.
well as a couple others.
I'm sure that she enlightened you about how tricky it is to try to balance budgets this year because there's just so much unprecedented uncertainty out there right now that it's really hard to know how much revenue you have coming in or what your spending is going to be. Um, what I want to encourage you to do here today is to break out of the budget bubble when you can and gain some different perspective. And by breaking out of the budget bubble, I mean forcing yourself to think beyond like the drumbeat of what it takes to balance your budget every year and thinking a year ahead or 2 years ahead if you have a biennial budget, and instead concentrate on how your state is is something beyond how your state's going to balance the budget. So you might ask yourself these kind of questions. How are my state's finances doing this recession compared with other states? Did we have an easier or a harder time making ends meet than other states? And why would that be? What's driving any fiscal pressure? Were other states better prepared for a downturn? Why might that have been? What does the Great Recession and a state's own trends tell us about what risks might even lie ahead? So looking backwards to look forward. Well, my colleague Becky Thies and I are going to give you some ideas for how you can take a bigger picture look that is going to help you understand the context of your state's fiscal situation. And it'll help you through some of these answers I asked. The purpose is to make your stories more meaningful. Becky is going to introduce her project's research on the role of federal dollars in states, and her information is loaded with lots of perspective that can open your eyes to the significance of federal dollars at your states. And of course, that's really relevant because in Washington, D.C. today, the Senate is grappling with this $1.9 trillion federal spending bill that may be sending some more money your way. And I'm going to introduce you to the Fiscal 50 project, which is what I direct. It provides data in online tools that I think can help you enhance your day-to-day coverage. It doesn't take the place of the data that you're getting because your data in your state, you're getting the most up-to-date data. But what we are trying to do is to drive some insights by looking at 50 states and seeing how states are doing compared to each other, and also looking at a long-term trend in your state to also try to drive some insights about what's going on. I think these things can also help give you story ideas by helping you see the long-term trends and understanding where your state's fiscal strengths and the weaknesses are. Um, Today, I'm just going to give you talk about a couple of the 10 things or so that we look at in the Fiscal 50 online indicator, but you can go online after this, and I hope you will, to pewtrusts.org state.org/fiscal50. And you're going to see these regularly updated graphics and analysis that I'm trying to explain to you how you can think about this data. You can use our words, you can take screenshots of our graphics just with attribution, and we also give you the data that's underlying our graphics in case you want to do your own analysis or you want to understand more about the specific numbers that are driving it. But first, I want to give you a piece of context. This is where I would start. Okay, so this represents all of the $2.1 trillion in revenue that states collectively amassed. And that pays for all the essential services that you spend a lot of time writing about too, like the health care for the poor and schools and public universities and prisons and roads. The single largest source, which you see here in the green, is state tax revenue. Tax collections then determine in large part the ability of states to deliver all these goods and services that we talk about. So I want to start there, and I think it's important as you cover state finances to like understand the big picture, so you'll know relatively which is more important than another. So I'm starting here because if I follow the money, taxes are the biggest amount. One interesting note here that I don't know if you know how much your state gets from taxes vis-a-vis these other sources, but actually at the end of this, we'll send you a link because we use the census data to produce a chart every year that gives you a sense. I will tell you, not every state gets all of its money from taxes. There are 6 states that do not get the greatest portion of their revenue from taxes. Instead, they get it from the federal government. So let's just move on. This is a look at the tax revenue indicator that we have on our site. What you see here on this blue line is the national trend line for how state tax revenue performed over the Great Recession. You can see the recession bar there. And then essentially, this is the longest economic expansion on record. It was the longest economic expansion according to records going back to 1854. Each data point on here, just so you can understand what you're looking at, each data point measures from the 0 line, which is the peak amount the states received before their revenue fell in the Great Recession. So each data point says, how much above that peak amount were you? Interestingly, this is the national, and it's an aggregate, not an average, but an aggregate. And each state rebounded at substantially different paces. And we allow you to see each state as your own state and see what the long-term trend has been. Of course, the pandemic brought an end to this economic expansion, and it ended what ended up being like a nearly uninterrupted 10 years of gains for tax revenue. The tail end is probably the part that's most interesting to you, but we're just beginning to get the data that explain to us what actually went on in this particular recession after the pandemic hit. I'd say that for our purposes, especially today, the trends here are much more important than the numbers. I'm just trying to get you used to the idea of what you can learn from this kind of a treatment of data. The first thing I think is really telling is the historical perspective. So what this tells me when I look at it is that it took nearly 5 years for states overall to get back the same level of inflation-adjusted tax dollars as they'd had in 2008, which was when the Great Recession hit for them. And you can think of that as purchasing power. So you can ask yourself, how long did it take for my state to get back? And yes, each of our graphics, you'll be able to tell what it was that you did. But also the growth over this period was slower than it had been in the 3 previous recoveries. And so what that means is that there was an uptick in tax revenue in the last couple of years before the pandemic. And some of that was artificial because it was induced by the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which was the Trump administration's tax cut. It changed a lot of the tax rules. Some of you may have covered some of that. And it changed a lot of taxpayer behavior. States had to adjust their revenues. There ended up being a greater amount of like personal income tax revenue paid to states until states adjusted. So if you can fixate on that, but you have to think about states went into this after a long period, for the most part, of slow recovery, which meant there were a lot of services that had been cut in the Great Recession that we did some research that found years and years later, states still had not been able to come up with enough money to replenish and bring back to where they'd been, like the amount of money that they used to give in support for things like higher ed and infrastructure and K through 12. So that's also a very fertile area to be looking at, not just the year to year, but looking backwards to see, if I adjust for inflation, or if I look instead at something like a per capita or per pupil, has my state, are we providing as much support as we did, even 10 years ago? In many of these areas, they had not. So it really matters, though, where you live in terms of how you came out of this. And I'm going to pick just a couple states to kind of show you what you can learn from this. So one of these is Nevada. I hope we have somebody on from Nevada.
Me.
Yay. Okay, good. Well, anyway, I was trying to pick states that we might have someone here. So you're going to be able to probably look at this and understand some of the things that were going on in your state at the time when you see the big changes. So the first cut I make about this is that we kept track during the expansion how many states actually had recovered their tax revenue, meaning in inflation adjusted terms, they were bringing in as much by the end of the expansion as they had before the Great Recession. And we found, indeed, 44 states were bringing in as much revenue as they had before the Great Recession. But the growth varied quite a bit. Well, Nevada is one of the 44 states. You can see this by seeing, excuse me, where the orange line crosses the 0 line. Okay, so that means they're ahead. They were growing. In 2016, you can also see that its tax revenue took off. Now, I don't know the state well enough to know if that was the economy or if it was a tax policy change, because if there is a tax increase, this is going to show up in how much money is collected. What this mostly allows you to do, though, is to put your state's long-term growth into context. So I'm going to say that as of the first quarter of 2020, which was really a high mark before the pandemic started pulling down revenue, Nevada's growth, since its peak in the Great Recession, was the 9th greatest in the country. And I think that kind of perspective drives more insights than just like quoting a figure about even how much higher it was or how much it had increased from year to year. Nevada's tax revenue fell in the second quarter of 2020, but that was true of all but 3 states, actually, because, of course, that was the quarter that GDP fell to its historic low, and it also affected tax revenue, of course, too. So let me just show you another state to sample this. This adds a green line for South Carolina. I hope we have somebody from South Carolina on.
Yep, we have South Carolina from the
Great.
state.
So let me just interpret this for you. Let's start over at the left-hand side. And what I see when I look at this is that, okay, first, its revenue started falling actually before the Great Recession. It had a greater decline in tax revenue than the national trend. And it also took far longer for its tax revenue to come back to where it had been years before. In fact, it was more than 10 years, not until mid-2018 that you see it cross that 0 line and having recovered. Okay, there have to be there have to be effects on this. South Carolina is not a state that it was losing population during that time, so you have to assume that there's population growth, increases in healthcare costs and things like that that it's absorbing. So what was happening in all those years when its tax revenue was lower? Like, where's the rub? What was actually going on there? It's a question I think that journalists are particularly well suited. When you have the right questions, you can go out and find the answers, but you kind of have to know. I'm not a believer that data tells you everything. Data raises intriguing questions so that you can go out and like find really interesting answers to what's going on. So even though it was once again collecting more revenue than before the pandemic, its tax revenue growth was 36th highest in Q1 2020 over the long term, measured back to its high point in 2007. So yes, it had recovered, but as you can see from this, in terms of revenue growth, Nevada had quite outperformed South Carolina when it comes to this. So in terms of, I was thinking of story ideas for you all as this goes on, and we're close to, not quite there yet, but as soon as we have 4 quarters worth of data since the pandemic hit, we're going to actually do a different graphic that's going to be able to look at what happened in this pandemic. And we're going to start this measurement all over again of like which states had the biggest drops or the biggest increases, so you'll be able to see how your state is doing and how it fits the national trend. And I think that that's like a secondary piece of information that you can use to give perspective to your readers about what's actually going on in your state's finances. The second thing I wanted to show you is, I think, the second most insightful indicator, and it tracks rainy day funds. So if you were to call me up and ask me about your state's finances, I would look first at tax revenue, and I would look second at rainy day funds. I think they are so useful in helping me understand how your state is positioned vis-a-vis others. So you can see here that this tracks it from 2 different recessions, and it's revealing because you see the pattern of how rainy day funds work, right? You save the money, a recession hits, you use the money. And that happened in both cases. There's a good news story here. And the good news, if you're following this blue line, is because it's a median line, that means that half the states are better than that and half the states are below that. But this gives us the general pattern. The general pattern is the states learned a lesson from the Great Recession and they built up their rainy day funds. Some of that was because they improved their policies of how you save rainy day funds. That's actually a really interesting area too that Pew works in. If you ever wanted to talk to somebody about it, do you have a rule that deposits just surpluses? Well, that isn't always guaranteed to build your rainy day funds. States are moving toward policies that say, if you have a surplus like in capital gains, that's a one-time, you're only going to get this 1 year, that's a good time to save. So grab one-time money and put it away for savings for a rainy day. States actually at this point have had a record amount of savings in rainy day funds, not just in dollar terms, but in what I consider the gold standard, which is as a share of what you spend. And we translate that into how many days could your state run on rainy day funds alone. It's the same as saying like what percentage of operating costs are covered by rainy day funds. And we actually provide both the percentage number and the days number. So with the savings alone, states could have run government operations for a median of almost a month. And that compares with 17.3 before the recession. I think rainy day funds, if you just looked at the long-term trend in your state, like I always find interesting things in there that could be the nugget of a story or could be some background that you could put into a story, because the issue is that it's not just what happened to the to the money, but it's like, what are the decisions? What are the trade-offs that had to be made for policymakers to build up rainy day funds? It is not easy to build up rainy day funds because every dollar you put in the rainy day fund is a dollar you are not spending on a service somehow. So it reflects a real discipline on the part of policymakers if they're able to do this, but there are trade-offs. So it's a more complex story than just, hey, what's happening to the money. So again, let's just take a couple of states. First, I'm going to look at here at Michigan, and Michigan here in orange. I picked this because I think this is a state that shows it learned a lesson from the Great Recession. As you can see, if you start from the left, it went through the 2001 recession, it used its funds, but it never built back its rainy day funds. It limped through the Great Recession without having a cushion to rest on. And it's not any surprise to people covering Michigan that the state had a really tough time. But what this shows is that by the end of this economic expansion, it had stowed away enough to run state operations for 40 days. Okay, that's even ahead of, that's in the upper half of states there. Pew counts that we've had at least 36 states that had saved more as a share of their operating costs before this pandemic than before the last recession. Now, at the very tail end of this, Michigan had made a rainy day fund withdrawal in FY 2020, but I think we've seen of late that it even has plans to transfer some surplus to make up for that and deposit some money next year. So it seems to be working to preserve its rainy day funds. That also tells me something, that if the state has the money to deposit into a rainy day fund, then maybe its situation is not as dire as in some others. Let me add a different state. I hate to pick on, I'm sorry, New Jersey, I'm sorry. I picked this because New Jersey is a state that learned its lesson about rainy day funds way too late. So as you can see, in the Great Recession, it didn't have a great amount of rainy day funds. It used them. That's what you do with rainy day funds. It was only I guess a year or so ago, it made its first deposit, $420 million, just before the pandemic struck. And it already has had to tap those savings. Okay, so now that does not give New Jersey the same kind of safety net as we even see in Michigan to deal with whatever it is that this pandemic is handing them. Overall, which is the perspective we also show you, this again is mostly important by just looking at if you can identify where your state is, and you can see if you're to the far left, you're among those states that has very small amount of rainy day funds as a cushion versus those on the right hand that have far more to deal with. So imagine what's the difference between how the states on the right are dealing with this new recession versus those on the left. And I find it an interesting comparison, and it tells me that there is more pressure in the states on the left because they have to turn to the other tools that are available to them to balance their budgets. And what are those? Okay, it's going to be spending cuts. It's going to be potentially revenue increases, maybe tax increases, in a few cases, borrowing, moving some money around, et cetera. But they have a lot more pressure on them than the other states, which is why I think that this matters so much. There has been like a Moody's Analytics analysis that came out in February that estimated that nearly a third of states don't have enough reserves to cover the effects of this pandemic. So they're looking at FY20 through FY 2022, which of course looks beyond this. And that's after they took into account the federal aid that had already gone to states, although it doesn't consider what else there is. And if you're interested in that, we might give you the link to that piece if you haven't seen it. It's an interesting piece that looks at all 50 states. So as I mentioned, like why this matters is that where you are in this probably spells differences in how much austerity or job layoffs, also in how much aid you might still be giving to your local governments. All of those things are affected by this kind of a measure. So, so that I can speed through and get to Becky, the last thing I want to do is give you the Fiscal 50 challenge. Okay, take 15 minutes, not now, but take 15 minutes, go through each of these indicators. In each one, you're going to be able to look at breakdowns for 50 states. I just challenge you to go through just quickly, look at where your state is. Where are you an outlier? Where are you ahead? Where are you underperforming? Because I think it speaks volumes about what your state's fiscal strengths and weaknesses are. And it may also turn you on to some story ideas or some of the drivers of your state's fiscal health that you hadn't actually looked at or thought about before. And of course, we're a resource if you want to talk to us about it more. Okay, so now I'm going to turn this over to Becky because she wants to talk to you about, I talked about the tax revenue. She's going to talk to you about the federal revenue. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I hope.
Thanks, Barb. I'm going to try to share my screen. Great. Okay. All right. That look good?
Yep, that looks good.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, Chris, for having us here today. Everyone, thanks for taking the time to listen to Barb and I talk about important federal and state fiscal issues. We're really happy to be here today talking to you about our work. So you just heard Barb talk to you about trends at the state level related to state fiscal health. Those are, I think, really important to look into to help understand what your state is going through. I'm going to focus a little bit on talking to you about the dollars that states get from the federal government. So I'm going to focus the majority of my comments on federal grants to states. That's funding from the federal government that goes to support policy priorities that are often a partnership between the federal government and states. That includes things like healthcare programs, transportation funding, education funding. But before I do that, I want to set the stage for kind of all the federal funding that goes to states. And what we find is that over 90% of all federal spending happens in the states. So in addition to grants, which is the purple slice you see in this pie chart, this includes spending on things like retirement benefits, contracts for goods and services purchased by the US government. So we say like paper clips and Navy ships, non-retirement benefits like Medicare and food stamps, and then salaries and wages of government employees. And then the other little bit of spending that doesn't happen in the states is relegated to things like interest on the debt, some foreign aid, and then other small classified payments. So while this is the totality of spending that we see in the states, I want to zero in on grants because that's funding that really does have impacts on state budgets and something that you may be spending time writing and reporting on. And like I said, it's also an area where we really see the federal government and states working together as partners. Okay, so first, how does federal spending fit into states' overall fiscal picture? When we talk about federal spending as a percentage of state budgets, we find that since the Great Recession, that share has held steady at roughly 1/3. So just to be very clear, this is looking at funding that states receive from the federal government for services like healthcare, Medicaid, education, et cetera, and how much that funding makes up of total state revenue. You can see the spike here in 2010 around the Great Recession. That was when federal revenue going to states was higher due to recession-related stimulus from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And then at the same time, during that period, state tax collections were lower. And in fact, this 35.5% that you see is the highest ratio that we've seen in 50 years of data that we have on this. Now, the latest data that we have is not reflected in this chart for 2018, but it does show that the share held steady at roughly a third. But I think an interesting story coming up is that we can expect the economic and policy response to the pandemic to impact this ratio, once we have 2020 data. As you know, over the last year, the federal government has pumped billions of dollars into state budgets to help pay for pandemic-related costs. And those infusions of aid are expected probably to help or to drive this share up in coming years. It will take us a couple of years to get that data, but it will be interesting to see how this ratio is impacted. And then, of course, if there are new policies under the Biden administration that kind of continue to send aid to states, that will be reflected in this ratio as well. And we are also able to show this by state. And the takeaway really is that federal grants vary as a share of state budgets. So in some states like Kentucky, Missouri, and Tennessee, the landscape is such that federal grants to states are a high share of total revenue in that state, up around 40–45%. And then in other states like Kansas and Wisconsin, it's lower, down closer to 20 or 25%. Now, changes that in like state revenue or federal funds, as you know, will affect this ratio and impact the state numbers that you see here. But it's important to keep in mind that a higher or lower kind of percentage that you may see in a map like this doesn't necessarily indicate a problem for states. It just shows a snapshot of how federal dollars are contributing in one year to the state's overall revenue picture. Okay, so the data that I'm showing you here is from 2017, and I think, like I said, we're hoping to publish 2018 data soon. This is an indicator that we update relatively annually. So as data becomes available, this chart and the one I showed you previously will reflect pandemic aid in the coming years. Okay, so next I'm going to shift gears a little bit to show you a different view of trends in federal dollars that have been flowing to state governments in recent years. Okay, so as I said before, federal grants to states exist in a lot of different policy areas. So income support programs, health, education, transportation, and we update this analysis annually where we look at the breakdown of grants by state, but also trends around those grants to states. And I want to be clear at what we're looking at here, because I know I just showed you a ratio of 32%. That was federal spending as a share of state budgets, of course, with the other part of that ratio coming from state revenue. And then this chart shows how much federal grants to states have grown relative to pre-Great Recession levels. So that is, you can see federal grants to states really spiked during the Great Recession relative to pre-recession levels as the federal government stepped in with increased aid to states. Those grants dropped, as you can start to see, in 2009, 2010. As stimulus funds phased out, they kept dropping. And then they started steadily rising again around 2013. And then as you see by 2019, federal grants to states were 42% higher than they actually were pre-Great Recession in 2008. And so what we do in our analysis is we really dig into the grant data and see, like, well, what can we attribute this steady rise to that we've seen really over the last, 6-7 years. And we found that Medicaid and other health-related funding really have been drivers behind this growth. Now, our update to this analysis that we're currently working on is exciting because we actually do have fiscal year 2020 data that will capture a lot of this pandemic-related spending. So what we kind of are starting to see in our analysis and what we expect this chart to reflect is a sharper increase in federal grants to states due to CARES Act money and other government stimulus efforts. So that 42% you're going to see in 2020, go higher. But one thing to consider when looking at this increase is what kind of drop are we going to see in the following years as COVID relief inevitably phases out, as we see relief from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act phasing out, back on the left side of the chart. And so it may be interesting in your states to follow how programs fare with these infusions of funding that they're getting during this difficult economic time, and then what happens during a funding drop-off.
Becky, we have one question in chat right now related to this slide. Just to confirm, was the spike in 2009 due to AARA?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes. Okay, so now I want to take a moment to just talk more about funding drop-offs and the role of federal funding in many of these federal state programs. So taking Medicaid as an example, this is a program that the federal government and the states jointly fund, but during both the Great Recession and this current recession, the federal government pumps money into the program to help states cover the costs associated with increased Medicaid enrollment. So as you can see in this chart, if you look at the Great Recession years, kind of in the middle of the chart, highlighted in the green bar, you see that the share of each state dollar spent on Medicaid actually went down during the Great Recession. And that's because the federal government stepped in and provided more support for that program with stimulus funds. And then when that extra funding stopped, we really saw a spike in basically states shouldering the costs of paying for Medicaid. And then even after the economy improved, the share of Medicaid costs shouldered by states remains elevated. Now this data ends in 2018, so we can't really see the effects of recent federal support and current federal support in this indicator. But as you're reporting, something to be aware of is this relationship between how federal funds work, especially as economic health changes, and how these can impact state budgets and what states are spending their dollars on. But back to the big picture of grants. So like I said, there's a lot of different types of grants, hundreds and hundreds of grant programs, maybe even thousands. I should probably find out how many we think that there are. But Medicaid, as you can see, is the largest grant to states. So when we're looking at the whole universe of grant money flowing to states, we see that Medicaid is about 2/3 of all of those dollars. While this is 2019 data, this is kind of what we've seen in the years prior to that as well. Our forthcoming analysis is going to update this data, and we're actually going to be able to show a pie slice of COVID funding, which is really exciting because we'll be able to show kind of how COVID grant funding looks in the scheme of all other grant funding to states. And our preliminary number crunching shows that it's going to be about a quarter of this pie chart for fiscal year 2020. And again, that just shows how kind of significant the government's COVID response has been. Okay, so I know this is a lot to take in. This is essentially that same pie chart, but it's your 50 state version. So you can see your state's breakdown of all the grant money that your state received in 2019. What percentage of that was Medicaid? What percentage of that was education grants? What percentage of that was transportation grants? So as you can see, I think, again, one of the really big takeaways from this chart is just the role of Medicaid grant funding. So in like 14 states in DC, I think Medicaid grant funding makes up over 2/3 of all grant funding to those states. And Wyoming is the only state where kind of the overall, when you look at the overall picture of grants, Medicaid is a lower percentage, and that has to do with kind of mineral leasing and oil leasing that happens in that state. But again, with this chart, our forthcoming analysis is exciting because we're going to be able to show coronavirus related grants by state as a breakdown. And so I told you, I think the national average is going to be about a quarter, but we're going to actually be able to show by state how that grant funding for the pandemic compares to other types of grant funding. And so we're excited to put that out in the coming months. And so these kinds of analyses that our team does at Pew, plus others, including deep dives into areas like higher education or natural disaster funding, really show like how federal policy decisions have fiscal impacts and consequences that ripple out in the states. And again, we would just encourage you to use the data to ask questions and be able to dive into the specific stories that your state has. So I think now would be a great time for Barb and I to take questions, and I'll see if I can stop sharing my screen.
Okay, so we had one question in chat from Laura. Do you want me to ask it, Laura? Do you want to ask? So why such a long lag on getting the budget data? We're nearly done with FY21 right now.
I'll take that one.
Okay.
The bane of my existence. It is this. We have 50 states. Their budgets are bizarrely different. It's not to actually do insightful comparisons that are also fair to states. You need apples to apples data. So a lot of what we rely on is the Census Bureau, who has, teams of people. I don't know how big anymore, but teams of people who reconcile all the different ways the states categorize money, and they allow us to look apples to apples at how states are doing. We actually have an analysis in the works right now in which we are trying to look at FY21 by looking at all 50 states' latest revenue forecasts to try to say, all right, what are they expecting in terms of revenue going up or revenue going down, as a way of helping us understand what's even happening across the whole country, but also which states are actually not getting hit as bad in this recession versus those that are. So that's the difficulty. And some of this data we collect ourselves, and some of it we rely on. The one source, if you talk to NASBO, I don't know if you've ever looked at NASBO's own research. They have a couple of different reports that they put out, I think each of them a couple times a year. That data is pretty good because they collect it by asking each state budget director's office to fill out a survey. And there you're able to get at least preliminary numbers that look at like FY20. That's what the one I would trust right now. They have some preliminary numbers from FY21, but when they fill out the survey, it's before it's before the year's over. And I don't know what's going to happen by June 30th. So I don't always trust the numbers when they fill out a survey before the year's even up. I hope that answers what you meant. And
who is the Census Bureau numbers? Where within Census do you get those numbers?
We get them from different places. There's a government finances survey. There's one of quarterly state tax collections. On each of our indicators, we have a tab that not only tells you the source of the data, but it gives you a link to the data. So you can actually go find it yourself, and maybe you can plumb it for some other ideas too.
Okay. So we have hands up from James, Stacy, Tiffany, and Stephen C. So go to James first.
Hi, yeah, this is James Barragan of the Dallas Morning News in Texas. You all may have heard, but we had some problems with our power grid, and the market is just really is really dire. I mean, we're in very dire situations where a lot of our electricity providers may be going under. And then there's this question of like $16 billion shortage in payments that our power grid provider has to provide to the people involved in it. It's all kind of really complicated, and I'm learning it as I go. But there's been conversations about using our rainy day fund, which is still in decent shape, even though we used it last time for plugging public education holes. But obviously there's also discussions about our public education promises that we'd made last session. And so I guess my question is, when it comes to the use of the rainy day fund and when should we use it, are there sort of guideposts to like, here's a good time to use it, here's not a good time to use it, or is it just kind of a gut check? I'm wondering if you all can give guidance on that.
Yeah, I will take a stab at it. If you actually want to go into this, we have people who know this even better than I do because they actually work on the policies. Rainy day funds, in the first place, they're set up differently in each state. And one of the things that Pew tries when they work with state policymakers, they advise is be very specific about what you intend to use this money for. So I don't know exactly how Texas has it set up, but there are states who say this is to be used in, a situation of tax revenue shortfalls or natural disasters. So it really depends what their wording is around what the policy was. Not unheard of to use rainy day funds for natural disasters. That's one of the express purposes in some states. So if you want to follow up, you might check with our communications person and they can link you with someone who can talk a little more about that.
Yeah, just to add on to that, we also have experts at Pew who really dive into state and federal natural disaster costs and like how they actually fund those things. So yeah, happy, like if you reach out to our communications person, I think we would have folks happy to talk to you about paying for natural disasters.
Thank you.
Okay, next go to Tiffany.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Stecker, and I'm a reporter for Bloomberg Law and Bloomberg Government in Sacramento. And I wanted to see if Pew had done any research or analyses on unemployment insurance trust funds. I know California is almost $20 billion in debt to the federal government at this point. It's that at this right now is going to fall on the backs of employers. They have to pay more in payroll taxes. They're probably not going to hire people, and that's not very good, coming out of a pandemic recession. So just wanted to see if you had looked into that at all.
So hi, Tiffany. I'm actually riding out the pandemic in Sacramento too. So hello from down the street. So I'm from here. So no, that's a great question. And I've been following, trying to follow a little bit the news about what's happening in California. And yeah, California is really interesting also just because of how the state, I borrowed from the federal government during, in response to the last crisis, and then spent it took a long time to pay those loans back. I mean, the short answer to your question is we are trying to look into unemployment insurance from kind of this federal state perspective. I'm not sure it's going to, that research is going to be able to directly answer what's happening in California. I mean, UI is a really interesting program. I mean, I would just encourage you, like, if you actually want data on how states are faring. I mean, the Department of Labor does have like good information about how much and when states turn to the federal government to borrow funding, to borrow money. But I mean, yeah, the short answer is like, we do recognize that this is a really important program, and we are, my team is conducting research on it, but I'm not sure I have anything helpful to offer you at the moment. I don't know, Barb, if you have any follow up on UI.
Okay.
No, I will just take this opportunity, though, to say I'm very glad the way you worded the question, because you understand how UI is funded. And too many times I'm reading in newspapers across the country that people are saying, oh, the UI is going to break the budget. Like, it's not part of your general fund budget. If any of you know that it is part of your general fund budget, let me know. But in general, it is not part of the general fund budget. It is funded by taxes on businesses. It becomes a budget issue if a state decides, hey, we need to help our businesses and maybe replenish the unemployment insurance fund out of general funds. But anyway, that's a little comment.
Yeah, and then and then the federal government is the federal government is generally responsible for paying for like administrative costs for the program. And, I think that some states have experienced issues, or in California specifically, issues with fraud. And so I know there are questions about how, how UI administration is funded and whether or not that's adequate. But yeah, so again, UI is interesting in terms of who pays for what, and that's something that we're exploring.
Okay, so we don't have a lot of time left, so if we could, Barb and Becky, if we could just have one of you take a stab at each question, so we can hopefully get through 4 more. We have Stephen C, then Stacy, then Lauren G, then Jill. So Stephen C.
Hi, my name's Steven. I'm with the Pennsylvania Capital Star. Just a quick question. I heard you guys talking about the Medicaid funding and how that's a big part of grants to states. But one thing that's happened in Pennsylvania is it seems like I know that it seems like when there's this in crises, in recessions, the state can like bump up its the amount of Medicaid dollars it sends to states. I think it's like FMAP, I think is the phrase that's thrown around in Pennsylvania, and like our state also relied on that to balance our budget. Is that something that you've noticed, at least in the last recession, or is that really something that happened in this recession? Just is that a trend you've noticed of like states relying on this boosted reimbursement to balance budgets?
Yes. So in the previous 2 recessions, the federal government chose the first way to give aid to states was by enhancing what's known as the FMAP, which is the federal matching, blah, 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 whatever that is. This is a program that's funded mostly by the federal government, but partially by states, by a formula that's based on poverty rates. And so it is considered one of the most effective ways for the federal government to get quick aid to a state when there is a tax revenue shortfall, because the states get the extra dollars. Money is fungible, so you have to cover your Medicaid costs. Like, you have to. It's an entitlement program. Anybody who's eligible can apply. You have people out of work. Generally, the Medicaid rolls go up. The federal government's idea is we will help you cover this, but the money is fungible. It actually helps states by covering those Medicaid costs. If there's money left over, they can use it elsewhere in their budget. So it is considered one of the most effective ways. And not everyone even writes about this very much. That was the very first thing that Congress did, was to increase the FMAP for states in this recession, although they didn't make it as generous as they had last recession.
Okay, Stacy next.
Hi, I'm Stacy Barchinger. I work for the Gannett newspapers across New Jersey. I was curious, I'm sorry if this is a basic question, but what's the difference between a rainy day fund and surplus?
I think these worse than that, like reserves. What do you mean by reserves? Okay, I'm using it in a particular way, and the way that we're using rainy day funds is if a state has set up something. You set up a separate fund. Sometimes it's called a budget stabilization fund. And you either have a formula that puts money into it, or you take a vote of the legislature and you put money into it. The surpluses, that's also a tricky thing, but at the end of the year, if you haven't spent all your money, that money is a surplus. It's held in ending balances. Actually, states ended FY19 with a lot of that. It was money that hadn't been committed. They got more money than they'd expected. And that money too help states get through the very first year of the pandemic. Does that explain it enough for you?
Okay.
Thank you.
Lauren G.
Okay, can you hear me this time?
Yep, sounds good.
Perfect, I fixed it. This is probably a question for Becky because it has to do with federal spending. It hasn't hugely. I'm Lauren Gibbons and I'm a reporter in Michigan for MLive, and I'm wondering if there's an easy way to see at what point the states need to spend federal money by. There's a situation in Michigan with some of the latest COVID-19 funding, and Democrats have been arguing that Michigan is potentially going to lose this money if it's not all allocated to the state agencies soon. And Republicans are saying that's not the case. I'm just not super familiar with that. So I was wondering if you might be able to enlighten me on where I could find some resources about when states need to spend grants.
Sure. Yeah. So, and I think you're specifically referring to pandemic related grants. So yeah, I mean, one of the issues that states have been grappling with all last year was that this coronavirus relief fund, which was this $150 billion pot of funding that went to states, came with this deadline to use it by end of December 2020. And states had a lot of trouble interpreting what that meant. Like, can we say what it's going to be used for, but actually spend it in January? And there was a lot of guidance that came out from like the Treasury that kind of tried to help states figure out how to actually, when they actually had to spend this by. But I know this is something that states struggled with and that each state kind of approached differently. That's specifically on the coronavirus relief fund. What recent legislation did in December was extend when states had to spend that funding by to the end of this current calendar year. Now, a lot of states had already spent a lot of that specific funding, but I think it did take some of the questions away from like state budget people about when do we have to spend this money. There are other programs, of course, not just the coronavirus relief fund, and they all, a lot of them do have different dates associated with it. The source that we use for a lot of our federal grant data work is Federal Funds Information for States, FFIS. It's a subscription service that said a lot of states I know use their data and subscribe to it. I wouldn't be surprised if you reach out to like your state budget office. They are likely very familiar with that data and may be able to give you information.